welcome to Stories for Wonderful Children. I'm Dan Wendelin, your host and storyteller. For many years, I improvised a new bedtime story for my children every night. Now, with their permission, I'm sharing the recordings of the best of those stories with you. Right now, we're about halfway through a long story that I told during the pandemic lockdown of 2020 about a girl who attends an online school for adventuring named Myra. I hope that you enjoy it as much as we did. 2 weeks had passed. Myra and her friends, despite their best efforts, had been unable to uncover why it was that the fates had wanted them to recover the shears, what they were supposed to do with them now that they had them. And so they had gone about their daily routine of school. There were only 6 weeks left until the end of the school year, and they were starting to think about getting ready for final exams, and so were redoubling their efforts of their studies, all the while keeping an eye out for other clues. Myra woke up every morning and hung her head over the side of the bed and looked at Tweety, who by now knew what she was going to ask. "No," Tweety said, "no dreams," holding up the dream journal to show her the empty pages. And so it was that Myra arrived at sneaking class to find that Professor Tad was not leading them down to the practice dungeon. Instead, he led them outside. He said, "Today, class, I'm going to give you your midterm assignment. We will have a final in the sneaker class, but this midterm assignment is worth 1/4 of your grade for this semester. So you should think carefully and act carefully. By the end of this week, I want you to bring me something from this campus that you should not have, from a place that you are not supposed to be. And once you've brought it to me and shown it to me, you will be assigned to put it back where it belongs. If you fail to bring it to me, then you will get a D in this class. If you fail to bring it to me, and I have to go talk to the administrator to explain why you were caught someplace you're not supposed to be, you will fail the class. If you bring it to me, and I have to have any sort of conversation with campus security about why my students are breaking into buildings they're not supposed to be in, you will get a C. If you bring it to me successfully without being detected, that is a B. If you bring it to me successfully, put it back where it's supposed to be with no one the wiser, then you will receive an A on this assignment. Are there any questions?" Myra raised her hand. "Do you have any suggestions, like what you mean?" Professor Tad looked at her for a long moment. "Myra," he said, "of all my students, you are the one who has most demonstrated an aptitude for being places you're not supposed to be, with things you're not supposed to have. So I have great faith that you will come up with something." "Okay," said Myra. Professor Tad looked over at Chelsea and Antoine. "What about you two?" he said. "Any questions?" Antoine shook his head. Chelsea said, "So, are there any ground rules?" "Yes," said Professor Tad. "You have 1 week." "Okay," said Chelsea. Is that it for class today?" "It is," said Professor Tad. "You are dismissed. This is an independent study project, so I expect each of you to work on your own." And then he turned and walked back into the building. And that is how Myra found herself at 3 a.m. standing outside the library.
"Oh no, bad idea, honey." Myra.
She thought to herself, she'd broken in successfully once. She just had to not get caught this time. She decided that this time she needed a different door to go in. She figured that it must be that particular service entrance that they'd used last time must be alarmed in some way. She had spent the last 3 days visiting the library during hours when she was supposed to be there, and loitering around the doors looking for alarm runes or tripwires or anything that would let her know how the librarian had detected them last time. She had wandered parts of the library that she was allowed to be in, but had never been in before. She was trying to see if she could find out if the rumors were true. Did the librarian really live in the library? But try as she might, she was unable to find any sort of alarm system or any evidence that the librarian lived in the library. And now she felt that her time was running short. And so she had picked a different entrance and had let herself in with the help of her lockpicks. As she stood there in an area of the library that she had not been in before, the sub-basement, this was where all of the library's mechanicals were, the heating and air conditioning systems, the humidifiers and dehumidifiers that made sure that the humidity in the library stayed at exactly the right level to protect the rare books and other objects that were stored in the library. She crept through this underground labyrinth, looking for a stairwell up to the stacks. And as she crept along, she saw up ahead a light off to one side, coming under a door. She thought, maybe that's where the librarian lives. And she determined to find out. Even if she had to leave, that knowledge alone would be worth it to make the time that she really made an attempt easier. So she carefully, soundlessly flitted from shadow to shadow up to the door. And then, seeing that the crack under the door was fairly wide, she took her little mirror out of her pocket and slid it under and looked and sighed. It was not the librarian. It was the maintenance man. She had not realized that they would have a maintenance worker on duty at all times, but it made sense. There were a lot of things that needed maintaining down here, and if any of them went wrong, it could endanger the more precious parts of the library's collection. So she crept on by, upstairs. She was going to avoid the secret zealot library this time. She thought that clearly that had been the point at which the librarian had found them, and so that must be the point that was somehow alarmed or trapped. Instead, she was already in a place that she should not be, but she needed to have something that she should not have. And so she had determined to steal, or borrow really, since she was supposed to put it back, one of the library's master encyclopedias of magic. Now, she thought that this was an excellent target because 1, those were never supposed to leave the library. 2, the library only had 1 set of them, and there were reputed to be only 5 sets in the entire world. But 3, it was a 58-volume set of encyclopedias. And so, if she took one of them, the chances that someone would notice that that was missing before she successfully replaced it after showing it to Professor Tad tomorrow morning seemed to her rather low. And best of all, it would be relatively easy to return it. All she had to do was walk in during regular hours with it in her book bag, and then when no one was watching, take it out of her book bag and put it back on the shelf. It seemed to her a foolproof plan. And so she crept through the stacks to the rare books area. She looked through the encyclopedias, trying to decide which one was most boring, which one was least likely to have some student need it in the couple hours before she returned it. She decided to get the encyclopedia about the use of various herbs for treating various forms of joint pain. It was not something that many people needed, really just the healers, and what were the chances that they were going to need that tomorrow morning before she had finished her sneaker class? She picked up the encyclopedia and placed it in the black, soft bag soundlessly, and then slung it over her shoulders and began to walk quietly back towards the stairs to the basement. She was moving in her very best sneak, flitting from shadow to shadow, soundlessly in her soft-soled sneaker shoes. And so she was almost shocked when she heard movement behind her. She looked back, and she could see from far the other side of the floor a light coming towards her. She began to move faster and switch directions, heading for a different stairwell. The light changed directions too. I am not making any noise, Myra thought. I'm not. This just, is not fair. She was not going to be able to make it to the stairwell. But, she thought, maybe I can just head out the front door before whoever that is. And even as she said it, she knew who it was, before the librarian gets here. And so she worked less on being unseen and being perfectly silent, since the librarian seemed to know where she was anyway. She started to move faster, at her fastest silent run, headed for the front door. She thought, if I can just get out. She reached the front door and looked back over her shoulder. The light was only a few sets of shelves away now, but Myra had been working with lockpicks all year, and this door, locked from the inside, and she was already inside it, so she simply flipped the latch and stepped out, dashing across the front porch of the library, glancing back to see the light being carried by the librarian come into view, the librarian moving at full run, and Myra stepped into the shadows of the bushes at the edge of the porch and disappeared. She still expected to be found. Clearly the librarian knew exactly where she was. She didn't know how, but somehow she'd been marked. She watched as the librarian ran up to the doors of the library and stopped, paced back and forth behind the doors, clearly frustrated, looking around, peering around the porch and off into the night, but not coming out onto the porch. That's bizarre, thought Myra. She waited, holding her breath, and after a few minutes, the librarian relocked the front door, turned, and disappeared back into the stacks. Myra, after counting to 100 to make sure that the librarian was not simply waiting for her to show herself, Myra stepped out of the bushes and quietly moving through the shadows back to her own room, her contraband safe in her bag, and a very strange incident bumping around in her mind. And that's where we're going to stop tonight. Thanks for listening to Stories for Wonderful Children. I created today's show, but questions and commentary were supplied by my children. The theme music was written by Brandon Thompson. and our wonderful logo was designed by Silas Wendelin. If you're enjoying the show, please tell someone about it, and leave a review with your podcast provider. You can now subscribe to the show to get extra stories and longer chapters of Myra and the Online School that combine multiple segments into a longer episode. The show's website is storiesforwonderfulchildren.buzzsprout.com. Until next time, I'm Dan Wendelin, reminding you to tell someone you love a story.